Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Casey. And it is my pleasure to introduce Adolfo Hernandez. In 2011, was appointed by Mayor Emanuel to serve as director of the newly created Chicago Office of New Americans. The Office of New Americans was created by the mayor to make Chicago the most immigrant-friendly city in the country by better leveraging the contributions of immigrants through enhanced collaboration between city government, community organizations, academic and faith-based institutions, and the private sector. Hernandez, who is the son of Mexican immigrant, and born and raised in Chicago Little Village, La Villita community, has worked to develop and implement policies and strategies that support the creation and expansion of immigrant-owned businesses that develop, attract, and retain talent and expertise from other countries, and that bolster Chicago's status as vibrant and welcoming international city. In September of 2013, the White House recognized Adolfo for his work in Chicago as one of the 10 local heroes who are champions of change and that work tirelessly to effectively integrate immigrants civically, linguistically, and socially into the fabric of neighborhoods by bringing all residents together to create welcoming communities. We are pleased to have him here today, so please welcome Adolfo Hernandez.
That was the best introduction I've ever gotten. Thank you. I wrote it, so that's why it was so good. So I always like to have a sense of who I'm talking to in the room. Again, my name's Adolfo Hernandez, and I serve as the City of Chicago for the Mayor, Rahm Emanuel, as his Director of the Office of New Americans. But I want to hear a little bit about you, so I'm going to ask you a few questions. Can you yell your name for me when I count to 3? 1, 2, 3. Okay, I got them all. Next. Can you, everyone who was born in the U.S., can you raise your hands for me? Okay, put them down. Everyone whose parents were born in the U.S., can you put your hands up for me? Fewer hands. Everyone whose grandparents were born in the U.S., can you raise your hands for me? Fewer still. Okay, I want you to yell out that country where either you were born, your parents were born, or your grandparents were born outside of the U.S. on the count of 3, okay? 1, 2, 3. So we're all from the same place. It's the same thing, right? So any room you do this in the city of Chicago, you get the same result. People are from all over the world. And that's one of the reasons the mayor created this office, the Office of New Americans in Chicago, because we knew that we had this sort of same diversity that you have in this room, and we viewed it as an asset, not a liability, not a weakness. We viewed it as a strength. And I think if we look at the talent and the people in this room, you should think of it as a strength that we're all from different places, that our families are from different places, that we bring a different set of perspectives and skills with us. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit about what we've done in the city of Chicago to try to make us the most immigrant-friendly city in the country. And sometimes I like to say in the world. Right? Let's go bigger. When I first met with the mayor, he set an ambitious goal of making the city the most immigrant-friendly city in the country. And I asked him if he knew what that meant. And he said, no, that's what you're here to do. Go figure it out. And so I said, okay, we're going to figure out what that means for us. So we took on a process of including our community partners. We have an incredibly active community-based organization, groups around the city of Chicago, and we wanted to make sure that they had a voice in helping us shape how we were going to get to this goal of being the most immigrant-friendly city in the country. So we invited 50 of these community-based organizations to sit with me over a 6-month period, collect information, collect best practices, call other cities. We ended up calling people in New York, LA, San Francisco, Miami, Houston, Canadian cities like Toronto, Montreal. We started looking at Spanish and Italian cities that were seeing a large group of immigrants coming from the Middle East and Africa. And all of these countries had their own way of either welcoming or not welcoming immigrants. And so obviously we wanted to take those best practices of the cities that were receiving a large influx of new people, of newcomers, and helping them to integrate, to be successful. So we ended up developing our Chicago New Americans plan. And so this is basically something we shared with our advisory committee of 50 individuals early on. And to give you a sense of who those people were, they were executive directors of nonprofits that worked with immigrants. They were faith leaders from faith institutions that also worked with immigrants. We had small business owners. We had big business owners. We had CEOs, chambers of commerce. We had academics. We had people who worked with students. And we also had dreamers, sort of the teen undocumented youth. So we wanted an entire cross-section of individuals who worked, who were, and who continue to sort of live alongside immigrants, and that was important. We wanted all those perspectives. So our plan, the focus, the way I think of my office is really an economic development office, and I'll explain a little bit more about why we do that in Chicago. But immigrants are good for our economy. We're just going to put it sort of that simply. They're absolutely vital to the future of the city of Chicago. They're absolutely vital to the future of New York, LA, San Francisco, and I would say they're absolutely vital to cities like Urbana and Champaign, and to cities all across the country, mid, small, big cities. We want to make sure we have the human capital to compete. A lot of you are that human capital, the very talented people that we want to make sure we keep here and attract to our cities. We want to make sure we're valuing the contributions that immigrants make to the city, so a lot of what I'm talking about this morning. And if you look at, on the right side, what this plan isn't about is supporting specific bills at the national level, supporting state bills. It's not about, we're not trying to make the argument for why we think we should keep immigrants or why we should support them. We're beyond that. We know we need them. We want to make sure we're helping them. So in terms of the city of Chicago, we've always been a city of immigrants, whether it was the Eastern European immigrants that settled in Chicago and helped to build our railways and our roads and make us the hog butcher of the world, to today, the largest immigrant group, and so some of those groups were Irish, German, Polish. Today, the largest group in Chicago of immigrants is from Mexico. But does anyone know the two fastest growing groups in the city of Chicago? Extra credit for that. No? So someone said Korean and Chinese. Any other guesses? No other guesses? Everyone's ready for unofficial St. Patrick's Day, it seems like. It's not the Irish either. So the two fastest growing groups in the city are actually Indian and Chinese. So you got it half right. Actually, we have a cool Chicago flag for you for getting that half right. There'll be a few questions throughout them. We'll throw those flags out. So the two fastest growing groups are Chinese and Indian, and what that speaks to is that the face of immigrants and who immigrants are is constantly changing in Chicago, and that's a good thing. Again, we're not shy about it. We're not afraid of it. It's good that we have constantly refreshing immigrant populations that bring new ideas, that bring new levels of entrepreneurship, that bring new cultural ties to their countries of origin. That's good for us. And it's always been that way. So what we did is develop 27 different initiatives in 3 different categories. So we looked at our immigrant-owned businesses and our human capital, and we packaged that into a section that looks at our economic growth. We looked at children of immigrants, whether they're documented or undocumented. We looked at how those parents interact with the school system, and that's within our youth area. And if we look at the bottom section, we're looking at our communities. Overall, how we provide city services to our immigrants, whether they're documented or undocumented, how we engage them civically. And what I should say for most of this plan in the city of Chicago, we don't differentiate between someone who's here legally and someone who's undocumented. The best way I've heard it described is from a dreamer, a young Latino male who said, "I may not be a citizen of the country, but I'm a citizen of Chicago." And he's absolutely right. People have access and rights to services that the city provides, regardless of their immigration status. So I'll walk you through each of the sections of our plan, and I'll go into detail in just a few of them. I won't read through all of this and bore you with it. But we looked at our immigrant-owned businesses, and one of the things we found that in Chicago, immigrants are opening up businesses at a 2-to-1 rate as our native-born population. This is true in major cities all across the U.S. 1/4 of all new tech firms, tech startup firms, are being started by immigrants. 40% of the Fortune 500 companies in existence were either started by an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. So what we know is these are very real, tangible jobs and economic contributions that immigrants are making, and they're doing it with an extra set of barriers in front of them, whether it's language, cultural, access to capital. So we looked at, for example, our first initiative, increasing the exports. And what you'll notice is some are highlighted and some are not. The ones that are highlighted are ones that we've actually implemented and made significant progress on. The ones that aren't highlighted are ones that are still in very early stages. So I'll start with one that we haven't implemented, increasing our immigrant exports. So naturally, immigrants have a really strong tie to their country of origin. So they tend to do importing and exporting at a higher rate than someone who was born here, creating a business, may not have any ties to another country. So we wanted to help those businesses expand the number of countries that they were importing and exporting to. So this is an initiative that an organization called World Business Chicago has taken on as a City of Chicago initiative to make us an import and export capital of the US. And the focus, one of the strategies, is to support immigrants in doing that. I'll move on to the ones we haven't implemented. Creating a Chamber of Commerce University. And so when we talk about business, most people don't think this is an immigrant initiative. But again, when we look at the population of business owners in the city of Chicago, we have 20,000 Latino-owned businesses, small businesses in the city of Chicago. We have 18,000 Asian-owned businesses in the city of Chicago. So it's close to 40,000 small businesses. And if in Chicago, about half of our entire population as the city either owns or works at a small business. So it's literally the backbone of our economy, of our jobs economy in the city, and it's in our best interest to protect it. So we're selfish. We want to make sure that these businesses keep thriving and expanding. So our chambers of commerce are trained on how to help those businesses set up. We provide training on how to create more of a tourist destination for each of the neighborhoods. We provide those chambers with additional funding to provide information in different languages, whether it's Spanish, Mandarin, Korean, Polish. I should mention the largest immigrant groups in the city today are Mexican, Polish, Chinese, Korean, and Indian, sort of in that order. If we look at Initiative 4, creating pop-up city services, this was a conversation we had with our Department of Business Affairs and Consumer Protection. And the first time I went to them, I said, we need to make it easier for an immigrant business to open up a business in Chicago. And they said, well, we're not going to create a program for a niche group. We're not going to create something special just for the small percentage of the population. And so then we went back to them with the data that showed Latinos were opening up businesses at a 2-to-1 rate of native-born. The Asian community was opening up businesses at a 3-to-1 rate as the native-born. And so their goals as a department relied on helping people to open up businesses, right? So if they wanted to be good at their job, they should be tailoring and helping these Latino and Asian-owned businesses do their work. So we streamlined our licensing process. We made it easier to understand. We started translating our materials into those top 5 languages that I referenced. And so far, we've seen an increase in the number of small businesses opening in the city. And they're opening mostly because of the drivers of these immigrant populations. And then we look at our tourism. And that's one I'll go back to in a second. Our tourism plan for the city of Chicago, we've actually moved up from the 9th most visited place in the US to the 8th. And though that doesn't sound that impressive, it's had a net plus effect of about 2,500 jobs in the city. And these are within all sorts of industries, including hospitality, restaurants, some of our tourist attractions. So how many people here know Millennium Park or Navy Pier? And generally cool places to visit? Yeah? How many people have visited the Chinatown in Chicago? How many people have visited Little Village, Humboldt Park? Fewer hands. Pilsen. Okay, some hands. These are actually cultural gems within our city. Chicago's known as a city of neighborhoods, but we don't necessarily proactively drive traffic into those neighborhoods. So as part of our tourism strategy, we're developing a neighborhood tourism plan that helps those chambers of commerce, that works with those immigrant businesses to market themselves as part of the city's tourism, as part of Chicago. So if you go to Navy Pier and you go to Millennium Park, on your first trip, on your second trip, you should come back to Chicago and you should visit Pilsen, you should visit Humboldt Park, you should visit Chinatown, and you can get a taste and a flavor of really other countries around the world within the city of Chicago. The next sort of section, we looked at our human capital, and that means people. We wanted to make sure that we had really talented people that would attract employers to the city. One of the reasons Boeing moved its headquarters to the downtown area of Chicago, two of the reasons. One was for the quality of life. A lot of professionals are looking for dense urban areas to work. They want to make sure that they can walk to a grocery store, that they can take a train to their place of employment, that they don't have to drive everywhere. So they want everything sort of nearby and access to amenities. So they wanted to move to a central downtown area. The second is they wanted access to really talented people. They wanted access to people like you. If we look at downtown Chicago, we have about 65,000 students within our downtown Chicago alone. A lot of these students are foreign-born, and we want to find ways to keep them here. So one of the reasons that we attract companies is because of our talent pool and because of our density. So we want to make sure that we are continuing to invest in that talent pool, whether you're an adult or a student. So if we look at our our number 7 initiative, one of the areas that we know a lot of our lower skilled immigrants aren't as strong in is having a high school diploma or speaking English well. So we've made some investments in ESL, English as a Second Language classes, across our city. And so it's a tiny little map on the right-hand side. We have 7 different city colleges, but if you can't get to one of those 7 different city colleges, how do you take one of these free ESL classes? Well, we took our instructors and started sending them out into churches, community-based organizations, other neighborhood institutions, so that now we have closer to 30 off-site locations around the city. That's on top of another 30, so total 60 different locations across the city where an adult that doesn't speak English well can go and get access to an ESL class free of charge. They can also get access to a GED class free of charge. And we can also help move them into our city college program. Our city colleges have restructured, and we have a program called College to Careers. And the idea is all these folks might not be ready for a university or 4-year institution, but it doesn't mean that they can't learn skills that are going to help them get slightly more advanced jobs. And so we have a certificate program that focuses on the healthcare industry or transportation and logistics. And there's each one of the 7 different city colleges has a focus area depending on the sector. And if you look at number 8, one of the things we want to do is work with people that are already employed. So if you're working in a hotel, if you're working in a restaurant and you have limited English skills, are there ways we can incentivize your employer to offer you English as a second language, to help you get your GED? And we can show them why it's in their best interest, why employees will be more productive, more effective, and also loyal. One of the biggest costs to any employer is turnover. Right, so they have to, if someone leaves, they have to invest in hiring a new person, posting, taking the time to find them, retraining them. So one of the things we've seen is employers that focus on developing their employees' skills, like English, like helping them get their GED, they have more loyal employees that tend to stay there longer, that then become great managers or move up that ladder. And again, this is what we want to help our immigrants do. We want to help them move up the economic ladder and better contribute to the city as a whole. Again, you're going to hear me say a lot of, we're doing for them, but we're doing for them because it benefits us as well. And that's really important. We're not shy about that. It's important that we invest because we're going to see a return on that investment. And so here our Choose Chicago, I said I was going to come back to this. This is actually on the left, you'll see a picture of the plan that our tourism agency is actually putting together. They're creating an entire website highlighting the cultural institutions within the city of Chicago. We have about 16 different ethnic business corridors. I mentioned like 26th Street in La Villita. Little Village is a neighborhood of 82,000 Mexican and Mexican Americans in one community. It's the youngest population in the city, a 2.6-mile business corridor stretch that generates a second amount of revenue, and it's second only to Michigan Avenue, the Magnificent Mile, which everyone knows. So this is an economic engine, not only of the community, but of the southwest side of the city. And so we recognize that and are making investments in drawing more attention to it, marketing it as a safe place. I think there's a lot, just spoke to a young woman who heard about a lot of the stereotypes of how we think about some of these neighborhoods as dangerous or unsafe. And we're doing the opposite. We're trying to attract people to come and visit it, not only as a safe place, but as a culturally rich neighborhood. Next, we'll move on to sort of the children of immigrants. And if you notice, all 3 of these are highlighted, and that's on purpose. I mean, right? So you hear people say children are the future. It's absolutely literally true that the investments we're making now in kids are going to shape what the city looks and feels like for the next 50 years. And because of our huge immigrant population, we have a large number of students that may be undocumented in our school system. We have the third largest school system in the country, 400,000 plus students. We estimate about 20,000 of those students are undocumented. So if you picture sort of their parents, we're going to have another 40,000. That's a total of 60,000 people. That's on the conservative sort of estimate side of things, just within our school system that touch that system. We want to make sure that those young people know that they have opportunities in Illinois and in Chicago that they don't have in other places. Has anyone heard of sort of the really anti-immigrant policies in Alabama or Arizona? So what Alabama and Arizona said is, we're going to help get people out of our state and out of our cities by making it so uncomfortable that they choose to leave. It's like being in a room, right? If we were in this room and someone moved the thermostat up to 100 degrees, chances are we're not just going to stay here. We're going to want to get out of here. So that's what Alabama and Arizona did. They said, if you're enrolling your child in school, you need to show proof of that child's citizenship and your citizenship. If you want to sign a rental agreement to lease an apartment, you need proof of your citizenship and of your family member's citizenship. Those are things we don't do in Chicago. That's actually exactly the opposite, and I'll tell you a little more about that policy in a bit. But the point is, our undocumented students in Chicago have access to education, free access to healthcare, regardless of their status. And again, these are the people that are going to be living here for the next 20 or 30 years. Do we want people with no skills? Do we want unhealthy young people? Or do we want people that we've invested in and can help contribute to our city as a whole? In terms of early education, the mayor's made a commitment of $36 million to increase the number of slots in our city by 5,000. So again, this is really being driven, the growth and the need for this is being driven by the Latino community, both by the birth rate and also immigrants, and also by the Asian community, which is growing exponentially within our city. So we're doing a better job of putting these resources in the neighborhoods that are needed. Our summer enrichment programs, we have last summer 17,000 summer jobs, this summer 18,000 summer jobs available to youth in the city of Chicago. Over 190,000 opportunities for youth to be engaged in some way, either by visiting museums, going to the library for different activities, going to the park district, participating in summer camps. I think everyone in here has probably heard about some of the violence issues that we've had in Chicago. Last year alone, that our violence rates and our murder rates have been the lowest that they've been in 30 years. So I think anytime there's an incident in Chicago, media tends to sort of stay on it just because it's a hot topic. But the reality of our numbers is they've seen a dramatic decline, and it's the safest that it's been in the last 30 years in terms of violent crime, murder, and other very serious crime. And a big part of that has been, we're not just sending more police out on the streets, we're making sure that we're keeping our young people engaged, that they have opportunities for employment, that they have after-school programming. And these are programs that we continue to invest in, because it can't just be locking young people up or putting people in jail or having more police officers on the street. That just moves it to a different street. We need actual opportunities for young people to be engaged. And again, because we have such a large undocumented population, we've opened up access to all of these programs for our deferred action youth, our dreamers. And if we look at Initiative 11, we actually helped organize one of the largest deferred action workshops in the country, where we had close to 13,000 youth come out to that Navy Pier, that tourist destination. 13,000 people, a sea of young people that wanted to become legal, that wanted to get on the right side of the law. And this is a really important message, right? A lot of these young people came through no fault of their own, were brought here when they were children. Right? How many of us decide where we're going to live when we're 3 years old? I didn't, right? I still sometimes can't decide where I live. But how many of us make those types of decisions about where we live, what we eat, who we follow when we're under 18? I'm going to guess almost none of us in this room. And so these young people, the president offered them an opportunity to register with the government, to be able to stay here and not get deported for 2 years, and to also be able to work and pay taxes. And that's sort of, these are the things that we need to remember. These are young people that want to contribute, that want to get on the right side of the law, that want to do the things that are right for the country as a whole, that grew up in our school system, that took the Pledge of Allegiance, that are American in every sense of the word except for on paper. And so I think sometimes when I meet these young people, they're the most patriotic people that I've ever met. They want to be American so much, and they know so much about our history and want to contribute, want to join the military. And if you talk to some of our native-born folks, I would sometimes pit them against each other in terms of what they know about our history, how they're willing to serve. I think the Dreamers are one of the sort of strongest organizing groups in the country. They have so much passion, and I think they represent in so many ways what it means to be American. So we wanted to make sure that we're providing services and access to them to be able to take advantage of this. And Illinois and the city of Chicago are third best in the country in terms of actually helping young people register for deferred action. The problem with deferred action is it's not a long-term solution. It's a solution for 2 years. The first kids that registered for it are going to be up for renewal this August. So ultimately, we need comprehensive immigration reform, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But here's just a few examples. On the left, you'll see a roundtable that we did with students at a high school called Instituto del Progreso Latino, students and their parents who said, all of these students are sitting next to their parent, and what each of them said is, I'm really happy I get to stay here, I'm really happy I get to work, but what about my mom? What about my dad? So I can stay here, but they might be deported at any time. And so does this policy make sense if we have a 15 or 16-year-old who can stay in the country, but we're taking their parents away? How does that 16-year-old survive? Right, so just think, how would you survive as a 16-year-old if your parents were pulled away from you, everything they own is gone, and you're left to figure it out as a 16-year-old? So that's what a lot of these kids are going through. On the right, you'll see kids participating in some of our summer enrichment programs at Soldier Field in Chicago. Again, we want to make sure that these young people know they have opportunities in the state that they don't have in other places. And I'll skip to 15. We're the only school system in the country that's requiring training for our counselors, our school counselors, our financial aid advisors, our college coaches, our principals, assistant principals, teachers. We want all of them to understand how to work with undocumented students. So we have some unique laws in Illinois that mean an undocumented student can go to university in Illinois and has the right to pay in-state tuition. We've created a privately funded scholarship fund for undocumented students called the Illinois Dream Fund. While it sounds great, it's a drop in the bucket to really the money we need to raise for our undocumented students. The mayor has raised close to $300,000, which sounds like a lot, but if you're paying for school, it's not really that much. Right? We need to raise a lot more because our undocumented students have no access to state or federal grants. And so that becomes another issue, right? Someone can go to school here, but they have to pay. And oftentimes their parents are taking out really high interest loans to help them get there. There are some universities that offer scholarship grants, private grants to undocumented students. So all of our counselors, financial aid advisors, teachers, coaches are learning what universities those are and how to advise our students. They're also learning about some of the mental health issues that affect some of these students, some of the depression that affects them, the fear of isolation, the fear of being separated from their families, some of them actually going through separation from their families. So we want to make sure that our school system is equipped to help these students as best as possible. 14, are creating parent engagement centers. We've created 31 parent engagement centers around the city. And what that means is that for a student, their families, their parents can walk into a school and get access to ESL, get access to a GED class, learn how to use a computer in 30 different languages. We can provide a curriculum to teach them how to do simple things on a computer that will help them help their children in school with their homework. Again, parents are the first teachers a child has at home, and it's important that they can help their children and don't feel completely separated from their education. I think the mayor's made it clear the worst thing a parent can do is said, I sent my kids to school and I'm done. We need parents to be engaged at every step in the process, and it starts at the earliest stages. So that's why we've invested in our schools having parent engagement centers where we're helping parents build up their skills. Two of the initiatives that I already talked about. On the right, we have standing at the podium Alejandro Morales. Alejandro is a dreamer. He's undocumented. He was the leader sort of all our JROTC students in the city of Chicago. We have 11,000 of them. He was the highest ranking one. All Alejandro wants to do is join the Marines, but he can't because he's undocumented. All he wants to do is join the Marines. And after that, he said he wants to start a business. So that's all he wants to do. And the Marines are actually facing a shortage of people that are qualified or physically able to meet the requirements for joining the Marines. He meets all of them, but he's unable to join them. This is, again, another example of a mismatch between sort of our federal policies and our talent. What you see on the left is actually a flyer for a Dreamers Conference that's coming up on March 22nd. What's amazing about this conference is that it's actually being organized and put together by dreamer clubs in high schools in the city of Chicago. 30 dreamers met with me 2 months ago, and they said, we're not getting enough help from the college coaches and teachers and counselors, so we want to help our peers all across the city. We want to host a conference. Will you help us? And of course, I was like, yes, that's fantastic. Thank you for taking the initiative and for asking. So we're helping them pay for all of the center, the materials, the activities, but they're actually leading all of the workshops. They've decided to also invite parents of dreamers to help them understand how to better help their kids. So this is just, I think, a really good example of we encourage our young people to take a really active role. And again, our dreamer population are incredible leaders. I'll talk about a few of these, and I might skip some. But our welcoming city ordinance is probably one of the more controversial things we've done. We've ensured that our police department will never work with ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, thank you, good. Will never work with ICE to deport our undocumented individuals. Now, I should say, when I say never, the only time we will work with ICE is if someone's committed a murder or a very serious felony of some sort. And I think we can all agree, if you've committed a murder, you've really relinquished your right to be here if you're an undocumented person. So that represents less than 1% of our undocumented population, right? So sort of this fear-mongering of undocumented as criminals is just not true, and we've seen it in Chicago. The reason we passed this ordinance is because it's important in terms of public safety for the city as a whole. If our immigrant community doesn't feel comfortable talking to police, reporting a crime when they're the victims of a crime, reporting a crime when they're the witnesses of a crime, then we've hurt our overall public safety as a whole. So this is something that our city council and our mayor took the lead on. It passed our city council unanimously. We have 50 city council members, so it's not easy to get 50 people to agree on anything. Just imagine trying to order a pizza and get 5 people to agree on what to put on it. Imagine trying to craft a law like this and get 50 people to agree on it. But every single one of them voted, yes, we should absolutely not work to deport or separate any of our families. This is something that not every other city in the country is doing. We're not entirely sure that this would be upheld in a federal court of law. But we've made a political decision, and we've made a values-driven decision that this is the right thing to do for our residents and for our Chicago citizens, that I like to call them. Initiatives 17 and 18 are all about better building those relationships with our police. So we've built the law. We have our superintendent of police that's enforcing this, but we also need to build training and additional procedures for our police department so that the people on the front lines also understand why this is important and are also living and practicing this code daily in their interactions. Since we've passed this law, we have had 0 interactions or 0 incidences of our local law enforcement being involved in the deportation of a person. And I'm really proud of that fact. The only criticism that we've gotten on this law has really been outside of Chicago, and that's when folks in Arizona were mocking this law and saying that we were the New York Times referred to us as the anti-Arizona, and that was the proudest moment I've had at this job. I want to be known as the anti-Arizona person. Immigration services fraud, oftentimes attorneys or people claiming that they have the skills of an attorney, notarios, take advantage of people and say something like, I can help you become a citizen if you pay $2,000 or $1,000. A family then goes and borrows this money thinking that, here's my opportunity to be legal. Gives that money over. This person steals their money, and they understand that the likelihood of this person reporting the crime, not high, because they're worried about being deported. So we've actually proactively gone after these businesses by shutting them down, sending undercover investigators, literally auditing all of them, sending an investigator to every single one of them, checking on their business practices. And I'll go through that one in a bit more detail in a sec. Oh, sorry. I don't know how I did that. So here's sort of our 2013 undercover investigation. 75 locations visited, 81% of them not in compliance. That's that bottom number. So it's very clear to us that while some of these businesses mean well, most of them are out to make as much money and take advantage of people as possible. We've looked at different ways to try to close these businesses down for good in our city. It's really complicated for a lot of issues, for a lot of reasons, I should say, but we're going to continue to crack down on them on a regular basis and make sure that people know where they can go. And where can people go? They can go to our Chicago public libraries. We've created citizenship hubs, citizenship corners, deferred action assistance centers at 27 of our Chicago public libraries. We have 77 neighborhoods in Chicago. We have 80 libraries. That means at least one library for every neighborhood. We know they're community centers. So we've started creating these citizenship hubs and corners at all those libraries where if you're a person who's a legal permanent resident, here's the other thing. A few numbers. We have about 600,000 undocumented in the state of Illinois, and it roughly breaks down into thirds. A third are undocumented, a third are naturalized citizens, US citizens, and there's another third which people don't often talk about. The third that came here legally, that are eligible to become citizens, and we want to help them through that process. And why do we want to help them through that process? They tend to earn more, they tend to pay more in taxes, they tend to spend more, they're more likely to buy a home, they're more likely to be engaged in their children's education. What person doesn't want those kinds of residents in their city? They're absolutely valuable residents to our city. So we want to make sure that we're helping those 200,000 people through the process of becoming citizens, and we've established those centers at our Chicago public libraries. So again, not every immigrant is undocumented, and that's an important thing to remember. Our immigrants come at every skill level and from all over the world. And we can do simple things just like hosting citizenship celebrations. So what you see on the bottom left-hand corner is the mayor presiding over a naturalization ceremony, which if you've never been to one, and it might be interesting to actually have one hosted here. Naturalization ceremonies are some of the most moving things you can ever attend. It's where someone swears their oath of allegiance to the United States of America. They have to pass a test, they have to pay a fee, they have to learn English. I mean, these are people that are committed to the US, right? And they're taking an oath. And so that was the first one that was ever hosted in the city chambers, city council chambers of the city of Chicago. To date, we've hosted about 6 or 7 of these in very meaningful city institutions. We want to make it clear immigrants are a part of our fabric, and we celebrate them any chance that we can get. And on the right-hand side is actually a child who is becoming a citizen. Again, they come at every age, at every skill level from all over the world. Here's an example of our Chicago Public Library, people naturalizing, sort of taking their oath, pledging their oath of allegiance, which we'll see how many of you know that oath in a bit. And here's an example of that just naturalization ceremony. So what I've talked about so far is what we can do at the city level, but right, we can't make every law, and we can't just decide to break laws or welcome anyone, whether they're undocumented or not. We can't sort of circumvent the federal and state laws. So we've worked tirelessly on a few state laws. One was creating that Illinois Dream Fund in the state of Illinois. So that's a top picture where you have Governor Quinn and our mayor, or my mayor, I should say, standing next to each other. It's not something that happens often. They're not so crazy about each other, but on this issue they are. On the bottom left-hand side, that's the press conference where we launched a push for driver's licenses for the undocumented in the state of Illinois. We're only the 3rd state in the country to pass that kind of law. And so now we have about 9,000 people that have gotten access to these driver's licenses. On the top right, we're at a rally supporting an end to deportations. Under President Obama, while he's been fantastic on deferred action and done some really great things with his executive power, we've deported more people than at any time in history. The highest number of deportations of any president in the history of the US. Now, this is at the same time, if you watch maybe So national news coverage, you might think we have immigrants start trying to overrun the country daily. The truth is we actually have a net zero of immigration currently. That means fewer people are coming because of the economic difficulties in the US, and it also means we have people leaving. So we do have some people still coming, but we have more people leaving and fewer people coming, which creates this net zero. So when you hear about we need stronger enforcement, everyone agrees we need good enforcement. We need strong borders. We want to be secure. Everyone should agree to that. But if you think that we're being overrun by immigrants, it's absolutely not true. And if you think that the president hasn't done a good job of an enforcement, and it depends what you think a good job is. By Republican standards, he's done an incredible job on immigration and in his enforcement. Unfortunately, it's leaving tens of thousands of kids without parents, which is creating then an economic burden on cities and states. On the bottom right-hand side, there's a picture of former Exelon CEO John Rowe to the far left, next to Congressman Adam Kinzinger from Peoria, the mayor, Senator Kirk, Republican senator, and Congressman Luis Gutierrez. We've been able to galvanize our business community in Chicago, very staunch Republican business community, to help support comprehensive immigration reform. And they're also doing it for selfish interests. They understand who their consumers are going to be. They understand where their workforce talent is coming from. And so they want to make sure that they're supportive of these immigrants. And so we have one of the strongest business leader coalitions in the state calling for comprehensive immigration reform. And we think we have a bipartisan way forward. But I think if we see what's happening in Congress, it's impossible to do anything on this issue for very partisan reasons. With that, I wanted to open it up to questions and say thank you to all of you for letting me come down and share that with you. Yes, up in front.
Sorry to be first again. I know you've only been on, I think, a year, but I don't know if you said
2
that.
years?
2 years.
Yeah.
Well, there was an incident in Pilsen that I don't know a whole lot about, but I think it was before you were on, and it was this standoff with 46-day standoff about a community center, La Casita, and it was eventually successful. The mass action was great, but you know, it sort of captures what's going on in Chicago on the ground. And I do have a question, which is, are these, what they eventually got was a TIF grant to improve the place, and they actually have a community center and a library there now. I'm just wondering if that's part of what's going on, is to improve the quality of life in these barrios and neighborhoods, because a lot of it is, you know, tourism and it's all kind of high level, but actually helping people on the ground. I mean, this place was going to be torn down, this little field house, very modest, to put in a soccer field for a charter school right
Sure.
next door, and it was successfully stopped. But I think it really captures a lot of what's going on the ground in Chicago that you haven't addressed. So I don't know.
Sure. So the initial effort, and it's La Casita, as part of Harris or near Whittier School in Pilsen, that actually Casita was eventually torn down, mainly for the reasons was that there was no way to actually get it up to safety code. And so one of the agreements when they didn't tear it down was that the community would help raise money and so that some TIF money would be used, but ultimately it was found that that community center, it would be cheaper to knock it down and build a new one. So that's sort of the process that has been undertaken with community involvement. I would say that our community strategy, outside of what we've talked about, is part of the mayor's overarching strategy. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about this, but our investments in youth programming at community centers where we're funding organizations based in communities has increased under Mayor Manuel with fewer federal funds to use them. We've built new domestic violence centers in communities where we need additional services. We've expanded our early childhood centers in communities where we need increased services. And largely, again, these are Latino and immigrant populations. So I would say, yes, we're making a lot of the infrastructure investments. Are we making enough? Probably not. And I think in a reality of constrained city budgets, I should maybe describe this. I spent 10 years working in the nonprofit sector advocating for these kinds of investments in communities all across the city. born and raised in Little Village. I currently live in Pilsen, just blocks away from the center you're talking about. You know, it's not easy to advocate, and it's always sort of, what it is easy to do is point out some of the flaws of communities or some of the challenges. And I think being on the other side for a little over 2 years now, trying to understand with very limited government resources what you can do to actually meaningfully change a community has been so hard, and it's been a bit of a wake-up to me. And it doesn't mean nothing can be done. It just means the challenges that cities across the U.S. are facing with constrained budgets is an incredible one. And I would just encourage anyone, any of you who are interested in making these kinds of civic contributions should consider a career in government. I think people might scare you from it or say it's sort of corrupt or it's cynical. I think that's why we need people who are not cynical, who are actually optimistic and understand communities, live in them, come from them. And I think I'm lucky to have peers at the mayor's office who think the same way.
Thank you. There is a problem, I don't know how you go about it. When the tourism comes to these neighborhoods, then prices go up, like by using the restaurants. I mean, it is good for business, but some of the original residents that
Sure.
bring the ethnic or cultural value to that neighborhood will get displaced. How are you going to go about that?
Sure. And so I think part of it is we have to weigh the interest. Do we not make investments in a community for that reason? Right, so I mean, this is actually a very real question. I think it's one, Pilsen's a really good example of it. 15, 20 years ago, the city was selling lots in Pilsen for $1 and couldn't get rid of them. Today, there's all sorts of new population moving into Pilsen. It's sort of there was an artist district on the east side of it, and now we're starting to attract restaurants and new businesses that are driving up the cost of some of that housing. So now the question to you is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right, so is having city lots that are empty and buildings that are falling apart and we can't sell them for $1, is that an ideal situation? I would say no. Is it an ideal situation when we have an area that's developing at such a fast rate that people that have lived there for 20 years can't continue to live there? I don't think that's a good situation either. So, but here's sort of the reality is which one do we want, or which one can we build? And so we've started to look at affordable housing policies from across the country. We know that development ultimately, from my perspective, is a good thing. We want communities to be diverse. We're one of the most segregated cities in the country. But when you look at, for example, again, when you have a new population moving in, it might change not only demographics, it might also change some of the costs of living in that community. Now, is diversity in a community a bad thing? People would say no. But if you talk about a new population moving into a historically Latino or African American community, it might be viewed as gentrification. But do we want a diverse community? So these are just the types of challenges that we deal with on a daily basis that are competing interests. And I think both of those values are right. Do we want to keep a historically Latino community Latino? Yes. Do we want a diverse neighborhood with different social, economic classes? I think yes. That makes a community stronger. So how do we balance these issues? And I think smart approaches to affordable housing has to be part of that conversation, but we also need to continue to make those types of investments that will ultimately end up changing at least part of the character and some of the costs of living in a neighborhood. And what I should say is this is my perspective that I could clearly talk about for hours because I live in one of those neighborhoods. It's something that's very near to me.
This might actually be related. I have a question about community or ethnic language newspapers. I know there's a long history of different ethnic nationality groups with their own local neighborhood newspapers published in their own language for their own people. Do those still exist? Are they growing or disappearing? And in light of your last comments, are there any bilingual, I suppose English, Greek, or English,
Sure.
Polish, or there might, to help foster communication, not just within a neighborhood, but between neighborhoods?
Sure. So I think that's a great question, and I think what we see is the rise of publications and languages as the population of that immigrant group increases. So I think there was a time when there was over a dozen Polish newspapers in the city of Chicago, and I think that's dwindled down to 2, largely because of the EU opening up to Poland. Our immigrant population from Poland has plummeted. That's still significant because we had so many people move here, but new immigrants from Poland, it's almost down to 0. So where we do have increase in community newspapers are within Spanish and Mandarin because of our large Latino and Asian and Chinese immigrant areas. So I think that that's very closely tied to those communities. The Polish community is obviously not happy that they've lost a lot of their community papers, but they're also, the demographics are changing. One of the things we're looking at is a language access policy, and that's less about community papers, but more about how the city communicates with individuals. We want to make sure that our agencies are communicating with people in the language that they speak. 1/3 of households in Chicago speak a language other than English as their primary language at home. So it's a city of 2.7 million, 33% of those households are speaking a language other than English at home. So if we're not talking to them in Spanish, Polish, Mandarin, we're not talking to 1/3 of the city, and that's a problem. Another question?
Yeah, I was interested in this fellow who wanted to join the Marines and couldn't do it because he wasn't naturalized. I want to ask you about the schools. I went to high school in Chicago, Sun High School on the north side.
Great.
Okay, and it's a classical building with 2 wings and a main body of the building. And previous administrations made the decisions to turn over 1 wing to the U.S. Navy. That school, when I went to it, was largely a white school. It is now mainly a Latino school. So my question is, I don't know how widespread that is, if SEN was unique or if this was done in other schools that had other kinds of ethnic compositions.
Sure.
But it's interesting to me, I don't know whether it was done for disciplinary reasons or what the thinking was. But would people who are not citizens be permitted to go through that Navy high school? Though apparently from what you said, they wouldn't be able to join the Navy. But the larger question is this kind of decision that was made before
Sure.
Ron Emanuel got in there to deal either with learning problems or disciplinary problems or whatever by militarizing the high school.
Sure. So that's a good question. I think that that decision, as you mentioned, goes beyond further back than Mayor Emanuel. But what I will say is we do have the largest JROTC sort of number of students of any school system in the country. And so that's 11,000 out of a 400,000 student school district. So, you know, it's significant, but it's not the overwhelming majority. The other thing to note about our school system, it's an overwhelmingly person of color school system. And this is something that most people don't think about. If you look at the demographic breakdown of the city, we're about 30% Latino, a little over 32% African American, and 32% white. About 5% Asian, 5 to 6%. If you look at our school system, that tells you a lot about where our population is trending. Out of our 400,000 students, 46% of them are Latino, about 44% of them are African American, and the rest are white and Asian. So that tells you a lot about who sort of the future demographics of our city are. So in terms of militarizing the schools, which demographics has it affected more? At this point, anything we do with our school system is going to overwhelmingly impact our Latino and our African American students, and that's because we're a Latino and African American serving school district in a lot of ways. So there are a lot of schools that have given either part of their building to these programs, or some of new schools have been built. What I will say about these students is they tend not to join the military, whether they're documented or undocumented. They tend to have a higher graduation rate and go on to 4-year colleges than our traditional schools. I'm not saying they're better or worse. Their outcomes have been really good, but they haven't been focused on feeding people directly to the military. and our undocumented students can attend those schools. Yeah.
I have a general question about the schools, and I notice you have many wonderful programs, and some of them, many interact with the community in some programs that could be in the neighborhood public schools. Chicago has closed many neighborhood public schools, and the charter schools are growing. I wonder if the school closures are affecting the immigrant neighborhoods and if there is a growth of charter schools in those neighborhoods.
So there's about 52 schools that were closed as part of the consolidation. The city lost 183,000 residents, largely on the south and west side of the city. And I think this is something that whether you're a teacher or a neighborhood resident or a student, I mean, there's no way, no one is happy about this decision, including sort of the mayor and the administration. I don't think anyone takes the idea of closing a school lightly, right? Because whether that school's at 10% capacity, which many of these schools were designed to fit 600, 700, 800 students, but only had the population of 100 or 200 students. So the cost of these running in schools was an issue, just realistically. But you still have 100 students there and 100 families tied to these schools that love and care about it. So first off, I don't think it was an easy, I know it wasn't an easy decision, and it's a very controversial one. Largely that has impacted the African American community, because that 183,000 is overwhelmingly African American that we've lost in the city. And because we have such a segregated city, some neighborhoods were harder hit than other neighborhoods. Two areas of growth for our city: there was a net growth of 25,000 Latinos and about a little under 10,000 within the Asian community. So we saw a lot fewer closures within the Latino community and almost none within the Asian community, because that's where again, because we're segregated, we could look at those pockets and see growth. And so largely these decisions were made based on utilization of schools and what level of capacity they were at. And so we actually still see some overcrowding in Latino schools. And I think that's what's complicated to some folks is we're closing down schools in one part of the city and opening up schools in another part of the city. And what you have to think about is we've lost close to 200,000 people in one part of the city and gained 25,000 people throughout different neighborhoods. So again, I don't think these are easy decisions to make, but these are just some of the sort of the realities of the populations that we're working with.
I was wondering if you could comment on some of the metrics that you're using or planning to use to judge how effective these programs have been overall.
Sure, so I think each plan, so while you're looking at this, and there's some plans out there in case you're interested. This is about a 20-page report, an executive summary. We have a 50-page full plan. On my desk is a 360-page document. For each of these initiatives, we have an implementation plan, a cost sort of analysis, but also an outcome analysis. So we want to measure how many, for example, how many of our counselors are we training or are fully trained? How many students is each counselor helping get to college? How many officers have we trained? Have we built it into the curriculum of our Chicago Police Academy? How many incidences are we having of deportation or police participating in it? How many expos are we hosting in immigrant communities for small business? How many new small businesses do we have as a result? So the metrics for each of these have really been based on the program and the design of the program or the initiative. I think overall what we want to see is it's hard to measure, do one thing that says you're the most immigrant-friendly city. I don't think we'll ever get there or be able to just say that out loud. What we wanted to do was create a competition. So within a month of announcing this plan, I got calls from mayor's offices across the country, mid, large, and small cities. I mean, New York, San Francisco, they called, but also places like High Point, North Carolina, Dayton, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, were calling us saying, wait, what are you doing? Our mayor's office wants to challenge your mayor's office. We want to be immigrant friendly. And that's sort of the environment we wanted to create, because what was happening was the opposite. Arizona and Alabama were trying to outdo each other in how horrible they could be to immigrants. So we said, you go that way, we're going to go this way. can hear you. Oh, I never do that. I just stay in the city, and I don't know how I got here today. No, I'm just kidding.
What are some of the ways that these opportunities can be bridged with the greater county?
So our county is actually one of the more progressive. Cook County is one of the more progressive ones in the country. They've completely shut out ICE out of our jail system and don't honor any ICE detainers. So that means if you want to, if an ICE employee wants to walk into one of these jails and ask people if they're undocumented or not, they're not even allowed in the building. ICE does what they call detainers. They issue detainers. So basically, if I get pulled over and I'm undocumented, I get taken into a jail cell. My name gets run through the system. ICE ends up seeing that name, and they might not be sure if I'm undocumented or not. So they'll issue a request to the jail saying, hold this person for 2 days until we can figure out whether they're undocumented or not. If we figure out they're undocumented, we'll come and get them, but hold them for 2 days. The Cook County jail system has said, we're not going to do that. If someone has posted their bond or they've been let out and that we've found that they're not a sort of a clear and present threat, they're welcome to go. And that was also controversial, that the Department of Homeland Security came after our county and jail system pretty aggressively, but ultimately our policy has stood, Cook County's policy has stood. That was an ordinance passed by the commissioners of the county. I think one of the things that we've worked on is there's a mayors and managers caucus on the Northwest and Southwest region. So we've worked with them to try to share some of our policies. But I think what's clear to people probably in this room is not every mayor, not every manager has the same level of tolerance for immigrants or welcoming for them. So a lot of it really relies on the local leadership, one, and how active the grassroots is within those communities. Because if you don't have any pressure from the bottom, there's not a ton we can do to influence our decision makers.
In the interest of the few remaining students, I wish I'd have asked this question a little bit earlier, but I was wondering if you'd share a little bit about your personal educational background and the path that's taken you to where you are.
I don't know if it was a path as much as a zigzagging hopscotch of things. But so I grew up in Little Village in Chicago, went to a Chicago public school, went to a Chicago public high school, graduated and went to Columbia College in Chicago with a focus on journalism, so I feel like I can tell a story really well. But my first real job was running a Teen Reach program, a gang intervention program at a YMCA in Humboldt Park in Chicago, a largely Puerto Rican and Mexican community. And so, I remember growing up in Little Village. I lived on the 2-6 side of Little Village, which is one gang, but I went to school on the Latin King side of Little Village, which is a rival gang. And so I had to walk past that boundary every single day. Now, when I was a third grader, I was uninteresting to these gang members, right? They couldn't see me. I was unimportant. Today, if I walk by those streets, I'm invisible to them, right? I'm not their target demographic. They're looking at the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th graders. Those are the kids that they're looking to recruit. They're not looking for me. They're not looking for the babies yet. And so I remember the things that got me through that neighborhood were a lot of sports programming, after-school programming, parents making sure that I wasn't on the street sort of without any sort of activities to do. Do we have enough of that? Probably not. But that's why my first job was doing something really similar. So it was at a YMCA, making sure that kids had a place to go after school. We would keep it open late, whether they were members or not. We just wanted to make sure we had a safe facility for them. That took me into writing sort of grants and trying to fund more programs like this at different YMCAs across the city, which then took me to sort of this other world of doing health work with undocumented families through the All Kids program. I started helping families get access to healthcare services. Again, reminded me of my parents who were undocumented when they came here, and through a large part of my childhood were undocumented. That took me to working on a very different issue, which was urban transportation policy. And so I started looking at pedestrian rates of fatalities in the city. We started looking at things like urban green space. The neighborhood I grew up in, I didn't know when I was a kid, had some of the least amount of green space per capita in the city of Chicago. And when I thought about it, I learned how to play basketball on a rim in an alley, and I learned how to play baseball in a parking lot of a bank. And when you think these are things you learn in a park, usually, right? So I learned how to do these in concrete spaces. So one of the things we worked on is access to green space, open space, how we make sure that walking, riding a bike, taking transit is safe to do in communities. And I spent a lot of time doing community organizing within the Latino and African communities in the city. So I spent about 10 years doing that. And so I never thought I'd end up working for government. I was asked when Mayor Emanuel won his election, which I was not supportive of. I wasn't actively campaigning for him, but I was asked to serve on a transition committee for the mayor, where he selected 100 people to help him develop a plan for the future of the city. And so I felt very privileged to help identify some goals for the city. There were 99 people sitting next to me that were also developing ideas. And so that's really how I got sort of a relationship with the mayor. What I should say is I also spent a lot of time volunteering during all that professional life, doing volunteer work with my community-based organizations, either on helping immigrants learn English, helping them apply for citizenship. I chaired a immigration committee for the Logan Square Neighborhood Association, which is a grassroots organization in the city. So I've just always stayed involved, understood who my local elected officials were, who the departments that ran programs, who they were, built relationships with them. And an important part of city government is not just having a good idea, it's understanding how to implement it, how to pay for it, who the decision makers are. And it's not always an elected official that's the decision maker, because they often are getting advice from people that work in departments and agencies. Who are those people listening to? Who are they getting advice from? So I spent about 10 years in that world, and so I was appointed in 2011 by the mayor. And again, it was sort of an incredibly awesome undertaking to try to build something from scratch, but also an incredible responsibility, given that I came from parents that were immigrants and undocumented. And so I always thought, and I encourage you to think this way, I would rather be here for a few years and get fired for trying to do too much and do crazy things than stay here for the next 20 years, right? Because it would make no sense if we just wanted to fly under the radar. It would have been really easy to do. We wanted to be as aggressive as possible, and it turns out that approach has aligned really well with the mayor's approach. So he hasn't gotten rid of me yet.
At the beginning of the presentation, you say that to implement this program, it is necessary to engage communities and organizations. So I want to know how the community and other organizations are responding to this, to your office, to your work.
Sure.
Are they trusting your work, or what they are saying about this program?
I hope so. So we worked with community for a few reasons, actually. So I would say my first 2 months on the job, literally, I spent meeting with people. I mean, I probably had over 200 meetings with just community organizations, faith groups, business leaders, just nonstop meetings. And these are people that felt like they could never come into the mayor's office. So we were hosting these meetings in the mayor's office. They were coming in, telling us all the things that they thought were wrong with the city, all the ways that they thought we could help. Or sometimes they just wanted to yell and have someone to yell at. But we sat there, and I had a small team with me, and we listened to everything they said, and we wrote down everything they said. And at the end of those 2 months, there were some patterns that were emerging. And so I would say, first off, I came from a background where it was important that we were listening to community, because I was that community, and helping bring those voices forward. So I brought that with me to government. So we made sure that when we convened our advisory committee of 50 people, we didn't sit down in the room for the first time together. Like, these are people that I had spent months talking to, that some were angry at the mayor, some were not happy with me, that we weren't moving fast enough, we weren't doing enough. But when we sat down in that room together with 50 people, we said, here's what we've heard. Here are the 20 things that we're gonna do. What do you guys think? And so when I presented those 20 ideas, they weren't my ideas, they were their ideas, reflected. And I would walk through and say, the first one, this is what we heard from these 10 groups. Second one, this is what we heard from you 15. So are they happy? I just did a update for the entire advisory committee last week, last Friday. They overwhelmingly were happy with this, but I love at the end they said, here are 3 more things you should work on. And so that's great, but they're there and they're like, and we're gonna help you. So here are 3 more things, we're happy to come back and help you. So the reason we included them, and I included them, was not just because I want to hear what they say, because they're helping me implement this. Most of these initiatives, they're partners on, and they're helping to collaborate. Sometimes I'm able to give them funding. Sometimes we're able to get funding together. Sometimes they're the only group getting funded externally, and I just help them sort of with a letter of support. The point is, there's no way I could do this work without our partners. If I'm not including partners, then it's just government trying to do something on its own, and I don't think that makes any sense. I should say maybe not everyone's happy, but we're trying to engage as many people as we can, and part of it is ongoing, still continuing to have those conversations.
Hi. Within your office or specific initiatives, is there any formal reach into healthcare utilization and access to services for immigrants?
That's probably the hardest thing. There was one initiative that focused on increasing the access to healthcare for the undocumented, which given the Affordable Care Act, undocumented individuals have no access whatsoever. We fund 7 different federally qualified health centers around the city that do provide those services, and they provide preventative services to the undocumented community and largely to our Latino and African American population that are living at or below the poverty line. So that's as far as we've been able to go, but this is an investment that the city has had for the last 20 years. We had one of the first federally qualified health centers in the country. Now we have one of the largest ones that's able to do emergency things, preventative things. But again, this is an area where things like comprehensive immigration reform will ultimately help people get more access to these types of services. And our hands are somewhat tied while we still make an investment. It's a limited investment, honestly. We were just there. That's the one I'm talking about, is in terms of the state of the art. That UIC Center has partnerships with community-based organizations across the city. We directly fund part of that federally qualified health center. They also got federal and state funding, but we've invested in it because we see it as a model for how to do it.
We're going to take one last question.
I see that most part of your job is the social assistance and educational programs for migrants. But most part of my job in Russia is countering against discrimination of migrants. It's everyday war against ethnical profiling of police. It's everyday war against really illegal deportations and other. Do you face in your work with discrimination of migrants, documented or maybe undocumented, and what are you doing in these cases, and how often you have to do something?
Sure, so that's a really good question, and part of the reason it wasn't up here, there's a lot that we're doing for immigrants that's not on this plan. So just so we're clear, this plan was basically filling in all the gaps of things we weren't doing. So what are we proactively going to do? It's not a report on everything that the city does. That'd be a huge binder. But our Commission on Human Relations actually deals directly with discrimination complaints, and I work with them closely. They have Commissioner Mona Noriega, who is very closely familiar with immigrant issues, and her entire staff has dealt with how to deal with issues of housing discrimination, rental discrimination, employment discrimination. One of the areas that the advisory committee asked us to be proactive on, that they don't think we're doing enough on, and I would agree, is protection for low-wage workers who may be undocumented, looking at things like wage theft. Oftentimes these are folks that don't come forward because they're afraid not only for their safety, but also of being deported, having an employer actually deport them or call immigration customs enforcement on them. So I think that was when I mentioned there's 3 things they want us to work on, that's one of the things we'll be tackling in the next year. So thank you so much.